The first bullet missed her ear by an inch. Dust burst from the wooden fence behind her, the sharp scent of gunpowder filling the air, but Evelyn didn't even blink. Her boots stayed planted in the red dirt of Deadwater Gulch's main street, her gloved hand steady on the revolver at her hip. The sun burned high above, branding everything gold and cruel. Men watched from the saloon porch, half drunk and half scared, muttering bets and curses under their breath. Everyone in town knew Evelyn Marlowe, the woman who never bowed, the woman who never missed. Across from her stood Jim Brody, broad shoulders, trembling hands, a man who'd mistaken her beauty for weakness. "I ain't letting no woman make a fool of me," he growled. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, the brim of her hat shadowing her eyes. "You already did that yourself, Jim. I'm just helping you finish the job." Gasps fluttered from the onlookers. Evelyn's voice was calm as whiskey at midnight, but her words cut deeper than a blade. Jim's face flushed. His finger twitched toward his trigger too slow. Her Colt fired once. The sound cracked across the town like a whip. Jim's pistol dropped from his hand before he fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder. A crimson bloom spread across his shirt. Evelyn holstered her gun, turned her back, and started walking before his body hit the ground. No one dared follow her. Inside the saloon, the piano player froze mid-tune as she entered. "Miss Marlowe," the barkeep stammered. "Didn't mean to cause no trouble today." "You didn't," she replied, sliding a few coins across the counter. "He did." She downed her whiskey in a single swallow. The room smelled of smoke, sweat, and stale dreams. Men stared, but none dared speak. Her reputation wasn't built on beauty, though she was striking, with dark auburn hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of storm clouds, but on what she did when unchallenged. And she was challenged often. Evelyn had lived 30 hard years in a man's world that never forgave strength in a woman. She had buried her father before she was 20, shot her first outlaw before 25, and now rode from town to town taking bounties, working for no one but herself. Still, that night, alone in her rented room above the saloon, she could not drown the silence. The wind moaned through the broken shutters. Her reflection in the cracked mirror looked back beautiful, yes, but hard as the land that had made her. "Strong?" she whispered bitterly. "They say I'm strong. But what good is strength when it just leaves you alone?" Her gaze fell to the Colt resting on the knitstand. The metal gleamed in the lamplight, cold and loyal. It was the only thing that had never betrayed her. Thunder rolled faintly across the desert. By dawn, Evelyn was already riding north, her horse's hooves kicking up the morning dust. She needed distance away from Deadwater, away from the echo of the gunshot, away from the way men stared at her as though she were both temptation and threat. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, painted in shades of ochre and bone. Cacti stood like sentinels among the rocks. Vultures circled lazily in the white sky. She felt the heat rise from the earth, rippling through the air like a ghost's breath. It was supposed to be an ordinary ride. But halfway through the narrow canyon pass, her horse reared suddenly, snorting and pawing at the ground. Evelyn drew her gun. The silence around her thickened, heavy and strange. Then she saw it, a dark shape lying among the stones. At first, she thought it was a corpse, a man, bare-chested, his skin bronzed and smeared with blood and dust, a broken arrow buried deep in his shoulder. Long black hair tangled around his face. The symbol painted on his chest faded red lines of an Apache. Warrior. Evelyn froze. She had heard stories. Apaches ambushing riders, scalping soldiers, haunting the canyons like spirits of vengeance. Every bounty hunter she'd met had a tale of a friend who never came back from Apache country. But as she dismounted, something in the stillness made her hesitate. He was breathing. Barely. Evelyn crouched beside him, her shadow falling across his still form. Blood pulsed slow and thick from his wound. The arrow shaft glistened with blackened feathers. The man's lips parted. A faint sound escaped, more growl than word. Her instinct screamed, "Leave him. Right away. Save yourself." But her hands didn't listen. They tore the arrow free. The man's eyes flew open dark, deep and defiant even in pain. Their gazes locked, and for a single, unguarded second, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in years. Fear. Not of death, of change. Because something inside her knew, even then, that this wounded stranger would be the one thing she could neither shoot nor outrun. And as the wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and destiny, Evelyn Marlowe whispered, almost to herself, "No man is strong enough for me." But somewhere, deep in her chest, a voice answered, "Not yet." Evelyn's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline as she knelt beside the wounded man. The arrow's shaft protruded from his shoulder, feathers blackened and bloodied, and his skin glistened with sweat and dust. He groaned low, eyes fluttering open, dark and wary. "You?" "Not soldier," he rasped, his voice rough like gravel sliding down a canyon wall. "No," Evelyn replied, steadying herself. "But I might be your last chance." He blinked at her, long black lashes coated with dust, as if measuring whether she was friend or threat. The sun burned both of them with its harsh, golden light, and Evelyn felt a bead of sweat run down her temple. She tore a strip from her underskirt, hands careful but firm, and wrapped it around the arrow wound. Blood seeped through, warm and sticky, but she pressed until the flow slowed. Careful. "Strong," the man murmured. "You'll live," she said, her voice quieter now, more focused. "I don't plan on letting you die here." He shifted slightly, grimacing at the pain, and Evelyn noticed the corded muscles along his shoulders and chest. Even in pain, even half buried in the dust, he radiated strength. Not the brutish strength of men she'd known in Deadwater, but something primal, untamed, as if he had grown up in the wind and fire of the desert itself. Tribal jewelry glinted in the sunlight, necklaces of beads and carved bone, bracelets around his wrists. "Name?" she asked, holding his gaze. "Kaetan," he whispered, each syllable measured, deliberate. His eyes, sharp, black, and endless, studied her as if reading her soul. "Evelyn," she said, offering her name with a nod. "I'm the one keeping you alive for now. Don't thank me yet." He let out a low chuckle, but pain cut it short. Evelyn winced at the sound, realizing how precarious his state was. "Why? Help me?" he asked between shallow breaths. "Because I help the dying," she said flatly. "Even if they scare me." Kaetan's eyes softened, not with gratitude, but something harder to name. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. It unsettled Evelyn, the first flicker of connection she had felt in years. She had spent her life fending off men who wanted to own her, tame her, or destroy her. And here was one who seemed untamed, yet not cruel. Slowly, carefully, she hoisted him to his feet. The movement was awkward. Kaetan's weight pressed against her arm and back, strong but manageable. Her horse watched silently, ears flicking, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood and sweat. Evelyn wrapped a spare blanket around him, draping it over his shoulders to hide the wound from prying eyes. "Can you ride?" she asked. Kaetan shook his head, pain twisting his features. "No, not now." "Then you're riding with me," she said, swinging him onto the horse with more strength than she realized she had. The weight was substantial, but Evelyn had spent years carrying burdens heavier than this. And somehow, in the act of saving him, she felt something stir in her chest, a sensation she hadn't known she'd been craving. Purpose beyond survival. The ride to town was slow. Dust clung to their skin like a second layer, sunlight painting both of them in gold and blood-red shadows. Evelyn kept her eyes on the path, alert for rattlesnakes, outlaws, and any soldiers who might be tracking an Apache in the area. Every so often, Kaetan would groan, and she would tighten the blanket or adjust his grip on the horse dot by the time they reached a small, abandoned cabin near a creek outside town. Evelyn's hands were raw, her back sore. But Kaetan was alive and alive because of her. She settled him on a makeshift bed of blankets, inspecting his wound again. "You're going to be okay," she promised. "I've seen worse, and I've survived it all." Kaetan's eyes lingered on her face. There was no fear there, only the quiet recognition of someone who had fought through her own battles. And Evelyn realized with a flicker of disbelief that she felt something she hadn't felt in years: trust. For the first time, Evelyn wondered if maybe not all men were weak, and maybe, just maybe, she hadn't met someone strong enough yet to match her. Kaetan coughed, blood flecking his lips, and Evelyn hurried to get water. As she pressed the cup to his mouth, their fingers brushed. It was electric and unspoken, a promise that neither of them could yet name. The wind outside rattled the cabin walls, carrying the scent of sage and hot earth. Evelyn Marlowe, who had never let anyone get close, now sat beside a wounded Apache warrior in the middle of the desert, knowing her life was about to change forever, and deep in her chest, something whispered that this was only the beginning. Night fell like a velvet cloak over the desert, turning the canyon walls into shadowed giants. Evelyn Marlowe had built a small fire outside the cabin, its flickering light casting dancing patterns across the rough wooden walls. Kaetan lay on the blankets she had spread inside, breathing shallowly, eyes half closed. The arrow wound on his shoulder had slowed its bleeding, thanks to her care, but he remained fragile, the kind of fragile that could disappear in a single, careless moment. Evelyn sat on the floor beside him, rolling a cloth in her hands. The fire's warmth contrasted the cool night air, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of blood. She glanced at Kaetan, whose dark hair fell in wild tangles across his forehead. Even in his weakened state, he radiated a strength that made her pulse quicken, not the kind of strength measured by muscle alone, but the quiet, steady endurance of someone who had survived far too many storms to bend. "You sleep?" she asked softly. Kaetan's lips curved into a faint, crooked smile. "I try," he whispered. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying a weight that seemed older than his 30 years. "You'll need more than that," Evelyn said. "You're lucky I found you when I did." His eyes opened fully then, meeting hers with a steady gaze that made her chest tighten. "Luck or fate?" he murmured. She frowned, tilting her head. "Fate doesn't leave men in the desert half dead. Luck, maybe. But I think maybe it was something else." He said nothing for a moment, but the firelight reflected in his dark eyes, showing shadows of memories she couldn't yet name. "My people. They have been hunted," he said finally. "They push us from our land. Kill, take, destroy. I swore I would never bow to any one white man, woman, or soldier." Evelyn's fingers stilled. She studied him, noticing the subtle scar on his jaw, the calloused hands that had clearly held bows and weapons, and the way he breathed through pain as if it were nothing. This was a man forged by fire and loss. "Then why let me save you?" she asked, her voice barely above the crackling of the fire. Kaetan lifted his head slightly, and Evelyn thought she saw a glimmer of something tender behind the strength. "You did not save me," he said. "You called me back." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Called you back?" "Yes," he said, wincing slightly as he shifted. "From the edge? Where death waits? You brought me back." She felt a strange flutter in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She had spent her life relying on her own strength, trusting only herself, fearing that anyone who tried to get close would either break or be broken. Yet here was Kaetan, a man who carried a mountain of pain and still stood, quiet but unyielding. And she felt, without warning, a pull toward him, an acknowledgement that some strengths were worth respecting rather than fighting. "Sit," he said suddenly, and Evelyn hesitated. Then she obeyed, moving closer to the blankets. Kaetan lifted a small carved wooden pendant from his bag, worn smooth by years of handling. "My mother gave me this," he murmured. She said, "Strength is not only in arms, but in heart. I forgot sometimes." Evelyn took the pendant in her hand, feeling the cool, polished wood. It was heavy with meaning, heavy with a story she could not yet understand. "You forget," she said softly. "But maybe. You just need someone to remind you." Kaetan's dark eyes held hers in a way that left her breathless. For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't feel the familiar edge of defiance, didn't feel the need to push everyone away. Instead, she felt the unspoken connection between two people who had survived horrors alone, and yet now, somehow, had found each other. The wind outside whispered through the canyon, carrying dust and the faint scent of burning sage from the fire. Evelyn realized that this night the desert didn't feel empty. It felt alive, charged with possibility, danger, and perhaps even something she dared not name. Kaetan lay back on the blankets, and Evelyn kept watch, her eyes flicking between the fire and him. Each breath he took was a testament to survival, each groan a reminder of fragility in a world that had been cruel to him. And as the flames danced, Evelyn Marlowe, the woman who had feared no man, felt the first stirrings of trust and perhaps the first hint of a bond she would not easily break. The night stretched on, endless and quiet, punctuated only by the crackle of fire and the sound of the wind. Evelyn felt it then, deep in her chest, a strange, persistent certainty that her life, and Kaetan's, would never be the same. And for the first time, she did not fear it. The desert dawn broke with a fiery orange haze, painting the canyon walls like molten metal. Evelyn Marlowe sat outside the cabin, scanning the horizon through narrowed eyes. Kaetan, still weak from his wounds, rested on the blankets inside, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The night had been long and silent, but Evelyn knew peace never lasted in a land like this. Her intuition had been right. Dust clouds rose in the distance, a faint but unmistakable sign of riders approaching. Soldiers. Not just any soldiers, but a small detachment likely sent to track Apache survivors. She stiffened, hand instinctively resting on the butt of her Colt. Kaetan stirred at her movement. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tense but steady. Kaetan's eyes opened, dark and sharp. "I can fight," he said, forcing the words past a groan of pain. No," Evelyn interrupted firmly. "You can barely lift your arms. Sit tight." But Kaetan rose, staggering slightly, his hand gripping the blanket for support. "I will not run," he said, voice low but unyielding. "I stand with you." Evelyn studied him. She had seen too many men fall under the weight of pride, but Kaetan's pride was different. It was forged from survival and honor, not arrogance. "Then we fight together," she said, determination hardening her features. The soldiers drew closer, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that glittered in the early sun. Evelyn's heart beat steadily. She had faced men before, outlaws and desperados alike, but this was different. They came not for her, but for Kaetan, and she could not let them take him. She grabbed her rifle from the cabin's corner, checking the bullets with practiced ease. Kaetan, grimacing in pain, clutched his bow and a small dagger at his belt. His fingers trembling but steady as the soldiers rode into view, Evelyn called out, her voice echoing across the canyon. "You want him? Come take him." The first volley of shots rang out, dust and rock flying with each impact. Evelyn rolled behind a boulder, firing with precision, each shot finding its mark. Kaetan, despite his weakened state, moved with uncanny speed, shooting arrows with measured aim, forcing the soldiers to hesitate and duck for cover. Together, they became a storm. Evelyn's Colt spit fire, while Kaetan's arrows sang through the air like deadly whispers. The soldiers, trained and confident, faltered against the unexpected coordination of the woman and the Apache warrior. One rider lunged at Evelyn, sword drawn. She sidestepped, driving her boot into his chest and sending him sprawling into the sand. Another aimed for Kaetan, but he twisted, striking back with the butt of his bow. Despite his injury, his movements were fluid, a deadly dance learned in the harsh deserts of his homeland. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat poured from Evelyn's brow, and her muscles ached, but she didn't falter. Kaetan's face was pale with exertion and pain, yet his eyes burned with an intensity that made the soldiers hesitate at every turn. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers pulled back, regrouping with a mix of fear and confusion. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands slick with sweat and dust. But her eyes never left Kaetan. He leaned against a rock, blood still streaked across his chest, but alive. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "You." "Strong," he said, voice low, strained, yet filled with a new respect. "You're not so bad yourself," Evelyn replied. Though her voice trembled slightly from exhaustion, the dust settled, leaving only the echo of hooves fading into the distance. Evelyn knelt beside Kaetan, pressing a hand to his shoulder, checking the wound again. "You'll live," she said, more for herself than him. "We're not done yet." Kaetan's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, the desert felt quiet, almost tender. But Evelyn knew better. In this land, danger always lingered, just beyond the horizon. Yet for now, they had survived. Together, and for the first time in a long time. Evelyn felt at hope. Hope that perhaps in this harsh, unforgiving desert, she had finally found someone strong enough not to try to break her, but strong enough to stand beside her. The canyon was quiet once more. But Evelyn knew the storm had only just begun. Night fell heavy and crimson over the desert, the moon rising like a pale sentinel above the jagged canyon cliffs. Evelyn Marlowe tended to Kaetan in the quiet cabin, her hands slick with blood from cleaning a shallow cut along his ribs. He had fought fiercely that afternoon, but the wounds were deep, and every breath he drew rattled with pain. "You should rest," Evelyn said, pressing a cloth against his side. Her voice was low, calm, but her fingers trembled just slightly from the adrenaline and fear that had not left her since the soldiers had ridden off. "I cannot," Kaetan whispered, each word a struggle. They will return." Evelyn shook her head. "Not tonight. They ran for now. Focus on staying alive. That's your fight tonight." He leaned back, eyes dark and heavy. His long black hair fell over his shoulders, damp with sweat, and the tribal jewelry around his chest and arms caught the flicker of the firelight. Even wounded, he radiated a dangerous, almost magnetic strength. Evelyn found herself staring, feeling a pull she had spent years denying herself. He was not like any man she had ever met, not weak, not cruel, not seeking to dominate her, but fierce, untamed, and unyielding. "You fight like mountain storm," she said softly, her words barely audible above the crackle of the fire. Kaetan's lips curved into a faint smile. "And you?" "Like the desert wind, sharp, unpredictable, dangerous." The room fell silent, the only sounds the hiss of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote. Evelyn pressed the cloth more firmly against his wound, careful not to hurt him further. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the power coiled beneath his skin, restrained only by injury. "You should leave," he said suddenly, turning his head slightly to meet her eyes. "I am dangerous. To you, to anyone." "I'm done leaving," she replied firmly. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "Every man I've ever met wanted to own me, to break me, or to control me. You fought beside me. You didn't try to tame me. That counts for something." Kaetan's dark eyes lingered on hers, and for the first time, Evelyn noticed a flicker of vulnerability beneath his strength. He reached out, brushing a strand of her hair from her face. His fingers were calloused, warm, and surprisingly gentle. "I am." "Not used to this," he admitted, voice low. "Neither am I," she whispered. And yet, despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, a spark of something else ignited, a connection forged in battle. In blood and in trust the night deepened, the fire casting long shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Evelyn moved closer, keeping watch over him, pressing another cloth to his side as he drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. She marveled at the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. Strong even in vulnerability, commanding even in weakness. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt safe not because the world was safe, but because she had found someone she could trust to stand beside her, to match her strength in a way no one else ever had. Hours passed, the desert outside quiet except for the whispering wind. And then, in the silence, Kaetan stirred, his fingers brushing against hers unconsciously. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let the contact linger, a silent acknowledgement that neither of them needed to speak the bond they were forming. "You are strong," Kaetan murmured in his sleep, almost a whisper. "Not like others, different." Evelyn smiled faintly, her heart tightening. "And you," she whispered back, "are the first man I've met who doesn't try to break me. Maybe that's enough." The fire sputtered low, leaving the cabin bathed in a soft orange glow. Evelyn kept vigil, her eyes never leaving Kaetan, listening to his steady breathing. Outside, the moon rose higher, blood-red and ominous, casting its eerie glow across the desert floor. It seemed to watch over them, marking this night as a turning point. A night where trust, survival, and unspoken desire had intertwined. For the first time, Evelyn Marlowe, the woman who feared no man, allowed herself to imagine something she had never dared before, a future not spent alone, and Kaetan, even in sleep, seemed to answer that possibility with a quiet, primal strength that promised he would not let her face the world alone. The night stretched on, endless and intimate, the moon high above as witness to a bond forged in fire, blood, and trust. Days had passed since the attack by the soldiers, but the desert offered no true respite. Evelyn Marlowe stood at the edge of the canyon, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Kaetan was recovering slowly inside the cabin, his strength returning but his body still bruised and scarred. The sunlight beat down on the red earth, making the sweat on her brow glisten like molten gold. Kaetan emerged from the cabin, leaning slightly on a wooden staff, his long black hair tangled and wild, tribal jewelry glinting on his chest and arms. Even in his weakened state, he radiated power muscles taut under bronzed skin, eyes sharp and alert. Evelyn couldn't help the faint thrill that ran through her at the sight of him, a combination of respect, awe, and something she didn't yet understand. "They will come back," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of experience. "They always do." Evelyn nodded, checking the weapons they had stored in the cabin. "Then we'll be ready. I've fought men who thought they were invincible. They won't be any different." Kaetan's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. "You fight like wind through the canyon," he said. "Relentless, unstoppable. Stronger than most men I have faced." "And you," Evelyn replied softly, "are stronger than anyone I've ever met." She hesitated, looking into his dark, penetrating eyes. Not because of your strength with a weapon, but because you stand, even when broken. Kaetan studied her for a moment, then nodded. I do not stand for myself alone, he said. I stand because of you, because of what you have done. For me, the words hung between them like a fragile bond, and Evelyn felt something shift deep inside her. For years she had trusted no man. Men had tried to control her, to dominate her, to bend her will. And now, here was someone whose strength did not demand submission, but invited respect and trust. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Evelyn tightened her grip on her rifle, scanning the ridges for any sign of the soldiers who had attacked Kaetan before. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast, harsh, and unforgiving. It was the perfect crucible for testing strength, resilience, and loyalty. That night, they sat by the fire outside the cabin, the stars sharp and bright above the canyon. Kaetan tended to his bow and arrows while Evelyn cleaned her weapons, the silence between them comfortable, charged with unspoken words. The flickering flames illuminated his bronze skin, highlighting the tribal jewelry that adorned him, and Evelyn's eyes lingered despite herself. You know, Kaetan said finally. Breaking the quiet, I never trusted easily. My people, they have been betrayed too often. But I trust you. Evelyn's gaze softened. And I trust you, even though I've never trusted anyone like this before. He looked at her then, long and steady, and for a moment the desert seemed to hold its breath. You are different, he said. You do not fear strength, yet you do not wield it for cruelty. That is rare. Evelyn smiled faintly, the first true smile in days. I've had to be strong alone for too long, she admitted. But with you, it feels different. Less like survival, more like partnership. Kaetan nodded, leaning back against the rock, eyes on the sky. We are stronger together, he said quietly. But there is a price to strength. The world will test us, again and again. And we must be ready. Evelyn reached over, brushing dust and sweat from his arm. Then we face it together, she said firmly. Whatever comes, we will face it side by side. No running, no hiding. Kaetan's eyes softened and he allowed a faint, rare smile. Then I will not falter. Not with you. The night stretched on, filled with the quiet murmurs of wind and the crackle of fire. Evelyn and Kaetan sat together, two warriors bound by trust, blood, and the unspoken promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as equals. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Marlowe felt that the world, harsh as it was, could not touch her, not when she had someone strong enough beside her to stand through every storm. And Kaetan, despite his wounds, knew that together they were unstoppable. The moon rose over the canyon, pale and unyielding, a witness to their bond. The desert was still, but the promise of trials hung in the air, and both knew that the true test of their strength was only beginning. The desert dawn bled crimson across the canyon walls, painting every rock and crevice in fire. Evelyn Marlowe tightened the straps on her revolver, her eyes scanning the horizon. Kaetan stood beside her, shirtless, bronzed skin glistening with early morning sweat, tribal jewelry catching the rising sun. His long black hair whipped in the desert wind, muscles taut, ready for whatever lay ahead. The silence was deceptive. They both knew the soldiers, or worse, would return. You ready? Evelyn asked, her voice steady but low. Kaetan's dark eyes met hers, fierce and unwavering. Always, he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the tension. With you, I am stronger than any threat. Evelyn nodded. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in the world. The desert had been her crucible, shaping her into a woman feared and respected, But Kaetan's presence transformed her strength into something she hadn't thought possible: partnership, trust, and perhaps even hope. The first riders appeared just as the sun crested the canyon. Dust plumes rose in the distance, dark specks growing steadily closer. Soldiers, armed and determined, their horses snorting and stamping the red earth. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken, but the fear that had once gripped her was gone. Now it was replaced with a steely resolve. "Stay close," she whispered, "and trust me." Kaetan nodded, drawing his bow. Even weakened, his stance was commanding, each movement deliberate and precise. Evelyn's revolver spat fire as the first riders approached, bullets finding targets with deadly accuracy. Kaetan's arrows followed, slicing through the morning air with lethal grace. Together they were a storm, unpredictable, unstoppable, and united. The battle was intense. Horses reared, riders fell, and the desert echoed with the sounds of gunfire and shouts. Evelyn rolled behind a boulder, her aim steady, every shot calculated. Kaetan, moving with a fluidity that defied his injuries, released arrow after arrow, each striking with unerring precision. The soldiers, trained and confident, faltered against the unexpected coordination of two relentless warriors. One soldier lunged at Kaetan. Sword raised, but he twisted with strength born of survival and swung his dagger with deadly accuracy. Evelyn fired at another, forcing him to stumble backward. Dust and sand swirled around them, sunlight glinting off weapons, skin, and sweat, making the canyon look like it was ablaze with motion and fury. Finally, the remaining soldiers pulled back, retreating in confusion and fear. Evelyn and Kaetan stood, breathing hard, faces streaked with sweat, dust, and blood, yet victorious. Kaetan lowered his bow, his chest rising and falling, muscles taut with exertion. Evelyn holstered her revolver, her eyes never leaving his. "You," Kaetan said, his voice low, roughened by battle and breath. "You are unlike any I have faced, fearless, strong, unyielding." Evelyn smiled faintly, her chest still heaving. "And you? You are not just strong. You fight with honor. You survive when others would falter. You're extraordinary." For a long moment they stood in silence, the desert stretching endlessly around them. The wind carried the scent of sage, sweat, and gunpowder. Evelyn realized, fully and irrevocably, that she had found someone she did not need to tame. Someone whose strength did not threaten hers but matched it. Perhaps for the first time in her life, Kaetan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, a gesture intimate and tender. Evelyn's hand lingered over his, their fingers touching briefly but with an electric promise. "No man is strong enough for me," she whispered. The words carrying both truth and revelation. Kaetan's dark eyes softened, and he answered without speaking, his steady gaze, his presence. And the bond forged through battle said everything. He was not just strong. He was enough. The sun rose higher, illuminating the canyon in golden light. Evelyn and Kaetan stood together, battered but undefeated. A pair of warriors bound by trust, respect, and the unspoken knowledge that whatever the desert threw at them next, they would face it side by side. And in that moment, the woman who had feared no man realized that she had finally found someone strong enough not to break her, but to stand with her, equally fierce, equally untamed, equally alive. The desert stretched endlessly before them. But for the first time, it felt like home, not harsh or lonely, but alive, full of possibility and shared strength. Together, Evelyn Marlowe and Kaetan, the Apache warrior, walked into the blazing morning, ready for whatever came next.